All right, so let's dive in. Today, we're tackling a question that I'm sure many of you Angular developers out there, have pondered. NGRX or NGRX signals. When it comes to state management in your Angular projects, which one comes out on top? Well, you've come to the right place. We're going to be taking a deep dive into a comparison report that breaks down these two approaches. By the end of this, you'll be well equipped to choose the best fit for your projects.
And choosing the right tool is so important. Each approach has its own strengths, and understanding those nuances will make a world of difference in your development process.
Now, before we get into the nitty-gritty of comparing them, let's just make sure we're all on the same page. For those who might be new to this, can you give us a quick breakdown of what NGRX and NGRX signals actually are?
Absolutely. Let's start with NGRX. It's a state management library inspired by Redux, which you might have heard of. NGRX works on the principle of having a single centralized store for your application data. And the interesting part is, this data can only be modified in a very specific way. We're talking about actions and reducers, a system that leverages functional programming to ensure that your state changes are predictable and easy to trace.
Okay, I'm already intrigued. I've dabbled with functional programming, but can you give me an example of how that actually plays out in an Angular application using NGRX? What does it mean for my code?
Let's say you have a counter in your app. In a non-functional approach, you might directly increment the counter variable, but with NGRX and functional programming, you dispatch an increment action. This action doesn't directly modify the counter. Instead, it goes to a reducer, a pure function that takes the current state and the action as input and returns a new state with the counter incremented.
So instead of changing the original data, we're creating a brand new state based on the action. I can see how that would make debugging easier. If something goes wrong, I can trace exactly what action led to that specific state change.
Precisely. It's like having a detailed log of every change in your application state. Now, on the flip side, we have NGRX signals, which takes a different approach. Imagine it as a network of reactive signals that carry state information throughout your application. And the great thing about NGRX signals is that it's a standalone library. This gives you a lot of flexibility in how you integrate it with your Angular projects.
Okay, so we have NGRX with centralized store and functional programming, and then NGRX signals with these signals carrying data around. That's a really interesting contrast. But what does this all actually look like in practice? Can you give me a real-world scenario where one approach might be more advantageous than the other?
Of course. Imagine you're building a real-time stock trading platform. You need instant updates on stock prices, and any delay could cost users money. In this scenario, the fine-grained updates of NGRX signals would be incredibly valuable. Each price change triggers a specific signal, updating only the relevant parts of the user interface, leading to a much faster and more responsive experience.
So in a fast-paced application like that, where milliseconds matter, NGRX signals would really shine. That's a great example. So we've got these two distinct approaches, each with its own strengths. Our comparison report actually lays out a really handy table that highlights some key differences, going beyond just the core principles we've touched on. It covers things like complexity, scalability, performance, and even the dreaded boilerplate code.
And that table provides a fantastic roadmap for our discussion. It highlights that while NGRX is known for its robustness and structured approach, NGRX Signals is often praised for its simplicity and ease of use.
Ease of use. That definitely catches my attention. I think any developer can relate to wanting to spend less time wrestling with complex setups and more time building awesome features. But I'm curious, when the report mentions NGRX being more complex, what aspects are we talking about specifically? Is it the learning curve, the way code is structured, or something else entirely?
It's a combination of factors. NGRX, with its emphasis on actions, reducers, and the overall Redux pattern, can take some time to fully grasp, especially if you're new to these concepts. There's a certain level of abstraction involved that requires a shift in thinking compared to directly manipulating data. This isn't necessarily a bad thing. In fact, it promotes cleaner and more maintainable code, but it does mean there's a bit of an upfront investment in learning the NGRX way of doing things.
That makes sense. It's like learning a new programming language. It takes time and effort, but the payoff could be worth it in the long run.
Exactly. And with NGRX signals, the goal is to simplify things. You work directly with signals, which are essentially reactive values that automatically propagate changes through your application. This often leads to less boilerplate code and a more intuitive development experience, especially for developers who are already comfortable with reactive programming concepts.
Okay, so NGRX is like that powerful tool and it requires a bit of training. while NGRX Signals aims for a more user-friendly approach. I'm starting to see the appeal of both. But before we get too deep into the pros and cons, let's zoom out a bit and talk about scalability. The report suggests that NGRX is the go-to choice for larger, more complex applications, while NGRX Signals are better suited for smaller to medium-sized projects. Is that a fair assessment? And if so, why is that the case?
That's a great question, and it gets to the heart of why choosing the right tool matters. Think of it this way. If you're building a small, single-page application, NGRX Signals might be all you need. It's lightweight, easy to set up, and can handle the state management needs of a less complex app with ease. But when you're dealing with a large enterprise-level application, with hundreds of components, intricate data flows, and a team of developers working on different parts of the codebase, NGRX's structured approach and centralized store become invaluable.
So in a large application, that central store acts like a single source of truth, preventing things from getting chaotic as the project grows and more developers get involved.
That makes a lot of sense.
But hold on, the report also mentions performance as a key difference. It says Signals excel in simpler applications, while NGRX holds its own in complex scenarios. Didn't we just say that Signals were all about speed? With those fine-grained updates, how does that play out in larger applications?
You've hit upon a really important point. While it's true that Signals can lead to performance gains, especially in applications where speed and responsiveness are paramount, it's not always a simple equation. In a smaller application with fewer components, those pinpoint updates can make a huge difference. You're only updating the parts of the UI that absolutely need to change, which can lead to a much smoother and faster experience for the user. But as your application grows in complexity, with more interconnected components and data relationships, those benefits might become less pronounced.
So it's not a simple case of Signals are always faster. It's about understanding the nuances of how each approach handles updates and choosing the one that aligns best with the scale and complexity of your application.
Exactly. NGRX, with its centralized store and emphasis on immutability, might actually be more performant in certain scenarios. It can optimize updates and prevent unnecessary re-renders, especially when dealing with intricate data structures and complex data flows.
I'm starting to see a pattern here. It's not about declaring one approach the winner and the other the loser.
Yeah.
It's about understanding the trade-offs, the strength and potential weaknesses of each, and making an informed decision based on the specific needs of your project.
You've got it. There's no one-size-fits-all solution. It's all about finding the right tool for the job.
All right, I'm feeling much more enlightened already. We've covered a lot of ground, from the core concepts of NGRX and NGRX Signals to how they handle scalability and performance. But before we move on, there's one more thing from that comparison table that I have to ask about: the dreaded boilerplate code. The report claims that Signals come out on top in this department. Can you elaborate on why that is? Every developer I know groans when they hear those words. What makes boilerplate code such a pain, and how do Signals offer a solution?
You're absolutely right. Boilerplate code is the bane of many developers' existence. It's that repetitive, often tedious code that we have to write over and over again, even though it doesn't really add any unique logic to our applications.
It's like filling out the same form 100 times. Necessary,
Yeah,
but definitely not the most exciting part of the job.
exactly. And with NGRX, because of its structured approach, you often end up writing more of this boilerplate code, especially as your application grows. You have to define actions, create reducers, set up selectors, and so on. It's all part of the NGRX pattern, and it ensures consistency and predictability. But it can definitely feel like a chore at times.
So,
Yeah.
how do Signals help us escape this boilerplate trap? What makes them different?
Signals offer a more streamlined way to manage state. Instead of defining actions and reducers, you work directly with reactive signals. These signals automatically propagate changes, so you don't need to write as much code to handle those updates. This can lead to a significant reduction in boilerplate and make your code base cleaner and more concise.
Less boilerplate. More joy. I can definitely get behind that. It sounds like both NGRX and NGRX Signals have some compelling advantages, depending on the project. But let's dive into the pros and cons of each approach a bit further. The comparison report we're looking at highlights some key advantages of NGRX, including its centralized state management, improved scalability, and those enhanced debugging features we touched upon earlier. It also mentions better testability and predictable state updates, which I know are dear to many developers' hearts.
Absolutely. Let's start with the centralized state management. This is one of NGRX's core strengths, especially for larger applications. Having all your application data in a single store provides a clear source of truth. Everyone knows where the data lives and how to access it. This makes it much easier to reason about the state of your application and to debug any issues that arise.
It's like having a master control panel for your entire application. You can see all the levers and buttons,
Yeah.
and you know exactly what's happening at any given moment.
Precisely. And because state changes are handled in a very specific way through actions and reducers, it's much easier to trace the flow of data and pinpoint where something might have gone wrong. You can step through each action, see how it affects the state, and identify the root cause of a bug more effectively.
That level of control and predictability is invaluable, especially in a large, complex application where things can get messy very quickly. And I imagine the testability aspect is tied to this as well.
Yeah.
Right.
Absolutely. NGRX's structured approach makes testing a breeze. You can easily isolate individual parts of your state, test reducers in isolation, and ensure that each action produces the expected state changes. This level of granularity makes your tests more reliable and helps you catch potential issues early in the development process.
So it's not just about writing code. It's about writing code that you can confidently test and maintain over time. That's a huge win in my book. But like any powerful tool, NGRX must have some drawbacks, right? The report does mention a steep learning curve, that infamous boilerplate code we talked about, and potential complexity in managing the NGRX setup itself, especially in those massive applications. It even mentions some potential friction with Angular's change detection mechanism. Are these concerns valid?
They are valid considerations, and it's important to be aware of them when choosing whether NGRX is the right fit for your project. The learning curve can indeed be steep, especially if you're new to Redux-based state management. It takes time to wrap your head around the concepts of actions, reducers, selectors, effects, and how they all fit together.
So there's an upfront investment required. But if you're planning to work with large, complex Angular applications, it sounds like mastering NGRX could be a valuable skill to have in your toolkit.
Absolutely. And once you understand the core principles, it becomes much easier to work with. However, it's true that the NGRX way of doing things can lead to more boilerplate code compared to other approaches. This is a trade-off for the structure and predictability it provides.
A classic trade-off. More structure often means more code to write. But what about the potential friction with Angular's change detection? That sounds a bit tricky.
It's not a major issue in most cases, but it's something to be aware of. NGRX works best when it has full control over state updates. Angular's change detection mechanism can sometimes interfere with this, leading to unexpected behavior or performance issues.
So you might need to make some adjustments to ensure everything plays nicely together.
Exactly. There are techniques and best practices to address these situations, but it's an extra layer of complexity to consider.
Okay, so NGRX is powerful and well-suited for large applications. But it comes with some learning curves and potential complexities. Now, let's flip the script and talk about NGRX Signals. The report highlights its simplicity, lightweight nature, and modularity as major advantages. It's also praised for its seamless integration with Angular Signals, and of course, we can't forget that glorious reduction in boilerplate code. It even gets a gold star for potential performance gains. Through those fine-grained updates we discussed earlier, can you break down those advantages for us?
Of course. Simplicity is one of NGRX Signals' biggest selling points. It's designed to be easy to learn and use, even if you're new to state management. You work directly with signals, which are essentially reactive values. And the API is very intuitive.
It's sort of a more approachable entry point into the world of state management, especially for those who might be intimidated by NGRX's complexity.
Exactly. And because it's a standalone library, you have more flexibility in how you integrate it with your Angular projects. You can adopt it incrementally, using it for specific parts of your application, or even alongside NGRX if you need to bridge the gap between the two approaches.
That modularity is a big plus. You're not forced into an all-or-nothing decision. You can choose the best tool for each part of your application.
Precisely. And as you mentioned, NGRX Signals integrates seamlessly with Angular's built-in signals system. This makes it feel like a natural extension of the framework, further simplifying the development process.
So it's all about streamlining the experience and reducing the cognitive overhead for developers. And of course, we have to talk about those performance gains.
Yes. The fine-grained updates provided by Signals can significantly boost performance, especially in applications with frequent localized state changes. Remember our stock trading platform example? That's where Signals really shine.
Right. By updating only the necessary parts of the UI, Signals ensure that your application stays snappy and responsive, even with a constant influx of data.
Exactly. And because Signals encourage a more component-driven approach to state management, you naturally end up with more focused and efficient updates.
Okay, so NGRX Signals offer simplicity, modularity, seamless integration with Angular, and the potential for significant performance improvements. It all sounds very promising. But before we get carried away, let's put on our critical thinking hats and talk about potential downsides. The report mentions that NGRX Signals is still under active development, which means the API could change. There's also a note about potential limitations with offline functionality, something that's becoming increasingly important for web applications. And while Signals excel in simpler applications, are there any concerns about their performance in those large, complex projects that NGRX seems so well suited for?
You've raised some really important points. It's true that NGRX Signals is still evolving, which means there's always a chance of breaking changes as the API matures. This is something to keep in mind, especially if you're working on a large, long-term project where stability is crucial.
So you might need to be prepared to adapt to those changes as they come along. It's the price of being on the cutting edge.
Exactly. And you're right about offline functionality. NGRX, with its centralized store, makes it easier to handle offline scenarios. You can persist the state locally and synchronize it when the connection is restored. NGRX Signals, being more focused on reactivity, might require some additional work to achieve robust offline support.
That's a good point to consider, especially as more and more applications move towards providing a seamless offline experience. Now, what about those large, complex projects? Is NGRX Signal still a viable option, or is NGRX the clear winner in those scenarios?
It really depends on the specific needs of the project. While Signals excel in handling fine-grained updates and providing a more reactive development experience, their performance benefits might diminish as the application grows in complexity and the number of interconnected components increases. NGRX, with its centralized store and emphasis on immutability, often proves to be more performant in those scenarios.
So, it's not a simple case of one being better than the other. It's about choosing the right tool for the right job, understanding the trade-offs, and weighing the pros and cons against the specific requirements of your project.
Precisely. There's no one-size-fits-all answer. And sometimes, the best approach might involve a combination of both. You could leverage NGRX for managing core application state and use NGRX Signals for handling more localized reactive updates within specific components.
So you can have the best of both worlds.
Yeah.
That's a really interesting idea. Now, the report we're deep diving into provides some practical use cases that I think would be really helpful to explore. It suggests that NGRX is a great fit for e-commerce platforms with complex data flows and a need for rock-solid predictability. On the other hand, it highlights real-time applications like chat or dashboards and ideal scenarios for NGRX Signals.
Those are excellent examples. Imagine you're building a large e-commerce site with thousands of products, shopping carts, order histories, and user profiles. You need a robust system that can handle all that data, ensure consistency, and make it easy to trace any issues that arise. NGRX, with its centralized store and structured approach, is a natural fit for this type of application.
It's like having a well-organized warehouse where everything has its place. And you can easily find what you're looking for.
Exactly. And because state changes are handled in a predictable way through actions and reducers, you have a clear audit trail of what happened and why, which is invaluable for debugging and troubleshooting. Now, contrast that with a real-time chat application. Speed and responsiveness are paramount here. Users expect to see messages appear instantly, and any delay can be frustrating.
It's all about that instant feedback, that feeling of a truly live and interactive experience.
Precisely. And that's where NGRX Signals excel. By updating only the necessary parts of the UI, Signals ensure that your application stays snappy and responsive, even with a constant stream of incoming messages.
So if NGRX is our reliable warehouse manager, NGRX Signals is our nimble messenger, delivering information with lightning speed.
That's a great analogy. And it highlights the key takeaway here. There's no single winner in the NGRX versus NGRX Signals debate. It's about understanding the strengths of each approach and choosing the one that best aligns with the specific needs of your project.
We've gone from feeling a bit overwhelmed by the choices to having a much clearer understanding of when to use each approach. It feels like we've leveled up our Angular skills today.
I'm glad to hear that. And remember, this deep dive was just the beginning. Both NGRX and NGRX Signals have vibrant communities and a wealth of resources available online. If you're interested in learning more, I encourage you to explore those communities, experiment with both approaches, and see what works best for you.
That's fantastic advice. A huge thank you to our expert for guiding us through this complex topic and making it so understandable. And to all of you amazing listeners out there, keep those Angular projects coming. And remember, the world of web development is always evolving, and there's always something new to learn. Until next time, happy coding.